When I was 15 years old, I lived in a rural area about 20 minutes outside of the actual town I called home. I was home from school alone one day, and a white car pulled up in front of our mailbox and stopped. I was upstairs in my room and saw from the window, but couldn't see who was in the car. Whoever it was sat there for several minutes without getting out of the vehicle, long enough to weird me out, and then drove away. We weren't super close in distance to our neighbors, but we weren't miles and miles apart, and I remembered that one neighbor a bit down was selling their house. I chalked it up to a potential buyer having the wrong address or simply checking out the neighborhood and thought nothing else of it. Fast forward about a week or so. It was a Friday night, and I'd gone downtown to see the premiere of a movie with my boyfriend at the time. I remember it was a special occasion, and I'd begged my parents consistently for weeks to push back my curfew so I could see this movie. Since it wouldn't be over until after 1 a.m., and it took 20 minutes to get home from town, they were reluctant, but finally agreed. When the movie was over, my boyfriend Jason and I walked slowly to the truck. It was a well-lit and relatively safe area, so we stood around in the parking deck trying to push curfew for as long as possible. There weren't many vehicles at that time of night, but I realized suddenly that I recognized the one parked straight across from us. It was the same white car that had been in my house a week earlier. The car was running and there was a man, maybe mid-30s, sitting alone inside. I could have passed this all off as a coincidence, except as I continued to look at him, he turned his brights on us and spun out of the parking deck after almost running into Jason's truck. I obviously had a horrible feeling about this and asked Jason to take me home immediately. As we pulled out of the garage, we saw the car parked across the street from the movie theater. All the lights off, man still inside, but he didn't follow us, so we just went home a little shaken. A couple months after the parking deck situation, the encounters became more frequent and weirder, and I hated being anywhere alone at any time. I never knew when and where I'd see him or how much time would pass between encounters. It became clear that he was watching me all the time by this point, because he only made himself known when I was alone or with my boyfriend, never with my parents or even other friends. I became terrified that none of my friends would believe me if I told them, so I kept it between Jason and my family. Until one day, my friend Rachel, who lived maybe 5 miles away from me, started telling me about this creepy man who showed up at her house over the weekend. Rachel's dad worked Saturdays, so she was home alone with another friend of ours, Megan. Everything was normal until around dusk, when they began to smell cigarette smoke. My heart instantly began racing because, by this time, this was becoming an everyday occurrence for me. I was smelling cigarette smoke, finding cigarette butts around my house, even though none of my family smoked and could never trace the source. I had a nagging feeling, of course, that it was connected to my stalker, but hadn't confirmed. So as Rachel and Megan were looking for the source of the smoke, Rachel realized she had left the window in the back room open and the smoke was coming in from the back porch. Seeing that there was a strange man on her porch, she quickly goes to close and lock the window, and in her words, he turns around with dead eyes and looks straight through her like she wasn't really there. Megan immediately called the police, but Rachel continued to stand there in a little bit of shock as he smirked at her and stared until his cigarette was done. He then got up and calmly walked away. The police came but found no trace of him except for cigarette butts on the porch and scattered around the backyard, indicating he'd been there for quite some time. I immediately began to describe the creep to Rachel, and it was the same man. She hadn't seen or heard the white car at all, and they guessed that he had parked down the road and walked down Rachel's almost mile-long driveway or through the woods a bit. As time went on, My stories were well documented with the police department, but they had never even seen the guy who was so good at getting away. I have to give them credit because they never doubted the truth in my stories and always showed up quickly, even as it was becoming apparent that this guy knew what he was doing and wasn't planning to be caught anytime soon. We also began to suspect he had a police scanner in his car. One night in particular, almost 2 years after the Rachel incident, Jason and I were coming home a little early from a date. My parents had gone out as well that night, and we had a strict rule that we couldn't be home alone with no adults. So Jason and I began to talk in the driveway, since my dad had called and they were only about 10 minutes away. We were too scared given the circumstances to get out of the truck, and we kept our eyes peeled for the creep, but we figured 10 minutes wasn't all that long. Sure as anything, not even a minute later we saw headlights turn on in the bushes across the street from my driveway. This freak had backed his car into the bushes and waited for us to come home. Jason immediately got on the phone with the cops, and I called my dad, who was literally flying home at this point. As the man revved up his engine and flashed his lights, he then proceeded to get out of his car and walk towards Jason's truck. I'll never forget, he was so slow, methodical, and emotionless. It felt like I was living out a serial killer movie. I was sobbing. We had the doors locked, of course, as the man walked up to the passenger side where I was sitting and stood only a couple feet away from my window, staring at me. He never made a move for the door. He simply stood completely still and stared. He held eye contact with me, with his eyes like black holes. Jason was a baseball player and had been keeping a bat in the back seat exactly for a moment like this. He pulled me toward him and away from the window and grabbed the bat, but this man didn't even flinch. He switched his gaze to the bat for a few seconds, smiled this huge and disgusting grin, walked back to his car, and drove away. It seemed like 40 minutes passed, but it couldn't have been more than 5 because the man had only been gone for a couple minutes before my dad came into our driveway, doing like 80 miles per hour. The cops never caught up to him. There were many more stories of torture, such as leaving dead animals outside on our front door and shining flashlights into our windows in the middle of the night, but nothing anyone did could trip this guy up. My family had tried everything. My older brother had even desperately tried to chase the guy through the woods behind our house one night and lost him. The police wanted to help, but they only had my stories and the corroboration of my boyfriend, Rachel's encounter, and one kind of vague sighting of the car in town. I didn't even have a name for anyone to file a restraining order against. Not that it would have done me any good. And maybe the creepiest part of all of this, in 3 whole years, he never spoke a single word. Then one day, just as quickly as he had showed up, every single trace of him completely disappeared. Just like that. I never knew if he died, was arrested for some other crime, or just lost interest, although that seemed highly unlikely. I just simply never saw him again, and it's now been 10 years. As an 18-year-old male, I never in my life thought I'd have any association with a stalker. In the media, stalker stories are always portrayed as some creepy bottom feeder becoming obsessed with a sweet but clueless girl and slowly invading every aspect of her privacy. My encounter with a stalker was far different. It occurred during the first time I was ever on my own. I'm originally from the East Coast, but I'm currently a freshman attending college in Los Angeles. Due to COVID, the dorms were closed and classes virtual, but I ended up coming to LA anyway, getting an apartment close to campus. I was really excited to move across the country and live on my own in a new city and get a taste of adulthood for a year. I wasn't completely alone though. I had friends from the past who had also ended up in LA. My friend Tommy was a close friend that I had made at camp years ago, who attended another college in LA. My other friend Felix was incidentally also from the same camp, and back in the day, the three of us had been very close. Felix had decided to take the year off and make music with his friends in LA. My apartment building was only about 8 buildings down from Felix's. However, with my packed weeks and free weekends, our schedules were nearly the opposite, with his weekends busy with work and his relative freedom during the week. As a result, I ended up growing particularly close to Tommy, and we'd alternate who went there due to the 20-mile Uber ride between us. Oftentimes, Tommy and I would hang out with Felix and his other friends whenever Tommy came to my area of the city. My apartment was about a 5-minute walk from a downtown area with restaurants, grocery stores, coffee shops, and boutiques. When I first moved in the fall, I took advantage of the pleasant nights, in contrast to my home's often harsh climate, by taking long walks at night through the well-lit and populated streets to explore and get familiar with my new neighborhood. LA is a beautiful city with a dynamic culture and unbeatable weather, but it does have the constant and often harsh reminder of homelessness, many of whom have mental illnesses and have otherwise been discarded by society. I had grown to despise the indifference that's shown toward them by people on the street who avoid their eyes at all costs, as if their life depended on it. In particular, during my first week, I was crossing a major boulevard when I noticed a man who appeared to be homeless in a wheelchair with one of his wheels caught in a deep pothole. He wasn't making any noise, but he was flailing frantically. I was far behind him and couldn't believe people were just walking past him, looking down at their phones. I wasn't even going to make it to the other side in accordance with crossing time myself, but I expected surely someone around me would help him. But people still passed by without even acknowledging him. I was so frustrated, I ended up yelling to the people ahead of me in the crosswalk and got a middle finger back. I asked him if he needed help, and he still didn't talk, but he nodded. He was crumpled into what seemed like a wrinkled but finely made tuxedo jacket. I could only see his frizzy blackish-gray hair thrashing in the clothes. I got his wheel out of the pothole and quickly wheeled him across the street. As I got him onto the sidewalk, he abruptly turned to me, exposing his face to me, only inches away from mine. I pulled away because he was way too close to me in the middle of a pandemic, and also because of his startling face. He was tan, a dark, worn tan with deep sun wrinkles, like you'd imagine on old people at a Florida beach, forming what looked like a mask. His eyes were sunken deeply into his head and completely dead. I mean, completely vacant. I didn't even feel like he was looking at me, but through me. "Get away," he growled in a voice that was so raspy, it didn't even sound human. I scoffed at the man and continued walking, assuming that would be the last time I'd ever see him. Especially in a city of 4 million people, and considering I pass hundreds of strangers a day that I'll never see again. I continue on with my life for some time and had forgotten about him entirely, but unfortunately, that didn't last long. To walk to the grocery store, I have to pass through an area with a great amount of foot traffic. In this area, one afternoon, I spotted a man in front of me that was soon to pass me, walking oddly. It wasn't exactly a limp. It was almost like he was drunk. It wasn't until closer that I recognized his blank eyes and frizzy hair. There was no wheelchair in sight. There was something about the man that raised major red flags in me. Maybe it was the vacancy of his eyes, or just some judgmental gut instinct that told me to get away. I tried to reserve as much judgment as I could because I figured he likely had some sort of mental illness. I was hoping to pass him quickly without acknowledgement, but when I got beside him, he stopped walking, causing me to momentarily pause. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I smiled at him and quickly kept walking. After that incident, I saw him many more times, and every time he'd turn to my direction. I learned to ignore it and barely registered it. Eventually, he went away for a while, and I foolishly thought that was the last of him. Months after I had stopped seeing him, Tommy was supposed to come over to my apartment. We were supposed to pick up alcohol for all of us before going over to Felix and his friend's apartment to hang out. As we were about to enter the liquor store, I could see the tall man with the tuxedo jacket standing at the intersection several feet past the store. I was somewhat disappointed that he had come back, but it wasn't the end of the world, especially because I was with Tommy and had learned to ignore him. I didn't even bother explaining the situation to Tommy though. Anyway, we had just checked out and left the store, taking a left to a nearby intersection away from the one I originally spotted him at. And guess who was standing at the crosswalk? My heart sank, knowing it would only be the three of us waiting for the crossing sign to change. Tommy was talking to me, completely naive to the situation, but I could see the man beside him turn to us. Tommy saw my face change and turned to the man. He quickly turned back to me, giving me a look upon seeing the man's face. The sign finally changed and we walked quickly across the street. Tommy continued talking to me, but at that point I was rattled. Up until then, I had never had such direct, prolonged contact with the man. "Are you good?" Tommy asked. I explained to him that I was seeing that man everywhere, all across my area of the city, and that every time I'd see him, he'd just stare at me. Tommy didn't really take me seriously and clowned me for being so worried. We got to Felix's house and Tommy soon forgot about the incident while we were hanging out, but I didn't. We all got fairly drunk, but I couldn't shake this nagging sense of dread. Eventually, around 2 a.m., Tommy had taken an Uber back to his apartment and many of the guys were going to bed. Honestly, I was still quite buzzed and irrationally afraid to walk that late at night, unlike the dozens of other nights that I've done the exact same. I was comforted by reminding myself that I'd only seen him in the commercial area, not the residential blocks around it, where we were. There were 2 cross streets between our buildings, and the walk usually takes about 2 minutes, and that night I was particularly paranoid and hurried. The streets were nearly empty, being that deep into the night and all. I passed one of the crossroads, but as I got closer to the next one, I saw a figure sitting on the curb of the intersection diagonal from the one I was about to reach. My heart started pounding, but I assured myself it could just be a drunk college student. As I got closer, I could see the white streaks in the man's hair. You know those moments when you see something so shocking and you get momentary tunnel vision? It was exactly that, and combined with my drunkenness, I almost fell over once I realized who it was. I turned around and wondered if I should run back to Felix's apartment. The man's head rose from his lap, glaring at me with his empty eyes. That moment is one of the only moments in my life that I felt genuinely in danger. I got to the intersection hesitantly, pausing at the sidewalk opening to the intersection. I expected him to stand, but he didn't. He stayed sitting on the curb, seemingly waiting for my decision. I looked down across the street and wondered if I should walk around the block so he wouldn't know where I lived, but part of me wanted to sprint to my building 200 feet ahead of me. My apartment building was large enough that he'd never know my apartment, but still, the thought of him knowing my address was unsettling. I was running through the choices in my head when I thankfully heard two guys approach the intersection from the opposite end of the crossroad, right in the path of the man on the curb. They were both drunk, but when they saw him, they looked at him and both looked at each other, then at me, frozen. "There you guys are," I yelled at them, beckoning them down the crossroad. They picked it up almost immediately, then yelled "Hey" back, quickly passing him. As we walked down from the intersection, one of them asked if I was okay. I explained to them what was going on, knowing they wouldn't remember in the morning. After a continuous flow of "bro," we had reached the street parallel to mine. They reached their building and said goodbye to me, and I was alone again. It had to have been 3 by that point, and I was exhausted. I decided to sprint home to my building from the other direction where he was, so I could quickly slip into the building without seeing whether he was still there. When I got to the door, I couldn't help myself and looked at the intersection as I unlocked the door, and he was gone. I quickly opened the door and closed it behind me. I pressed the elevator call button, anxiously watching outside the door through the glass wall. I didn't feel safe until I got back onto the elevator, after which I let out the biggest sigh of relief. I never told my parents this story. They were already so nervous about me living on my own so far away that they'd lose their minds and likely would have made me come home if I had told them. After that fiasco, I stayed in my apartment for a few days, working from there instead of going out into public. A few days in, I realized I was being ridiculous and left to get a coffee in town. Luckily, he wasn't there. For weeks, I continued to walk through the commercial area without any sight of the man. Weeks turned to months, which turned to academic terms. I'd gone home during the winter for winter break, and when I came back, I'd still yet to see him again. After enough time, I assumed he was gone. Maybe he had just been trying to scare me, and he was satisfied after doing so that night, so he was on to another victim. Once again, I made this stupid, naive assumption that he was gone. By that time, it was late into the spring term, and people had started to go back to their homes all over the country. A couple weeks before I left LA, Tommy and I were hanging out one last time the night before he was flying home. I'd grown to appreciate Tommy's apartment. It was one of the only places I felt entirely safe, due to it being so far from my neighborhood of the city. I had previously told Tommy about the events that occurred that night, and he finally believed me after that. The night of the final incident, I was over at his apartment, and the night was as normal as could be. Late into the night, Tommy and I had decided to take a walk to a 24-hour donut shop a couple blocks north of his building. We got to the shop pretty quickly and ordered our donuts. We were the only ones in the shop except for the 2 other employees, so we were served almost immediately. As we left the shop, Tommy turned around, and now it was his face that dropped. Tommy was the kind of person that, when he has a look of dread, you better take it seriously. I turned around in response and felt like I was going to faint. Standing under the dim light of the donut shop was the man. In the same dirty flip-flops, tank top, torn pants pulled up to his chest, and tuxedo jacket I'd come to associate with him. He stood there, staring at us. Not us. Me. This time, his eyes weren't empty. They were focused on mine like a laser, and I could see the fury behind them. Tommy and I were silent for a second, both of us frozen. I looked at Tommy and mouthed to run. In that second, the two of us sprinted back to his apartment at our fastest possible speed. Tommy never looked back, but when he was flashing his card to get past the locked door, I could see the man's uneven gait walking down the sidewalk towards us. The door unlocked and we ran into the lobby, slamming the automatically locking door behind us. We sprinted up the stairs to his floor where we caught our breath in the hallway. Tommy had a look of disbelief in his eyes and I was shaking with adrenaline. To this day, I have absolutely no clue how the man could have gotten 20 miles and known exactly where we were. It must have required such deep surveillance. I felt like I was going to puke thinking about it. Tommy was rattled and gladly left Los Angeles the following day. I was there for another week, but I was so busy with finals and packing that I didn't leave my apartment. I don't think I'll ever know what that man wanted from me or why he harassed me for months. By no means is this supposed to deter people from helping the less fortunate, but in rare instances, good deeds can come at unknowingly dark costs. I'd like to be noble and say I don't regret helping him, but honestly I do. When I come back to Los Angeles in the fall, I'll be in the dorms, as will Tommy. Somehow, that man was able to follow me 20 miles, so what's to say he won't also find me in the dorms only a few hundred feet from my old apartment? I can't call the police. What would I say? The man hadn't technically done anything wrong, and furthermore, LA was filled with vagrants, far out of the light of the police. I won't tell my parents because they'll kill me knowing I kept it from them the whole year. I can only wonder what'll happen this fall, and I guess only time will tell. A few years ago, I was using Tinder to meet friends and find a partner, which now I realize was a bad idea. I'd swipe right on everyone, hoping to find someone to talk to and just a friend, as I was kind of a loner with no friends and homeschooled. I remember meeting a funny girl named Katie. Katie started the conversation with memes and funny jokes and pickup lines. Me being someone who needed anyone to talk to, I was filled with excitement. We talked for a few hours and Katie ended up wanting my Snapchat username. I agreed and sent it to her, hoping she wasn't fake or a man using a fake picture, catfishing others. Katie added me and sent a picture of her face. To my excitement, she was real and just as beautiful as her pictures. After a week of talking, Katie started asking personal questions that kind of raised red flags. Where I lived, what my address was, why I lived with my family. I never sent her my address, but in my head all these red flags were raising, as she'd often guess what I was wearing or tell me that she likes my Blink-182 shirt before I even snapped her a picture. I remember always feeling like I was being watched and always looking over my shoulder. Not knowing about the Snap Map update at that time, I didn't think anything of it. A few days later, Katie had posted to her Snapchat story. Now before I go further, I wanted to mention Katie lived in a town 45 miles north of me. So anyway, she posted a picture of a playground park to her Snapchat story. Earlier in the day, me doing the usual skipping all my friends' stories, I didn't realize what I saw. An hour later, she had sent me a Snapchat of her at the park, along with the caption, "I see your house from here." To my disbelief, I realized she was at the park that was about a 3-minute walk from my house. Panicking, I responded asking where she was. She responded with the name of my city. Asking her what she was doing here, she had stated that she wanted to surprise me and see me. I had asked her how she knew where I lived, and she said that she had her connections. Now, I wasn't looking for a relationship with Katie. She was a nice girl, but not someone I'd be in a relationship with, especially since she had an 18-month-old daughter. I told her I was a little creeped out by her knowing where I lived without me ever telling her. That made her really upset. She started arguing with me and telling me how I didn't appreciate her taking the time to surprise me. Keep in mind, we didn't plan a date, and I wasn't even interested in a relationship with her. I remember her saying something really rude to the point where I blocked her. A few hours later, I'd run to McDonald's with my dad to get dinner for my family. As we were ordering, I felt my stomach drop and a cold chill went down my spine. Something was off. I turned around and saw Katie standing behind me, looking insanely upset. I quickly turned back around and pretended I didn't see her. I hear my name come from her mouth and my father looks confused. I turn around and walk up to her and she chews me out again, asking why I had blocked her. Being the nice person that I am and giving people the benefit of the doubt, I unblocked her and gave her a hug, stating that I had been busy with my family today. As soon as I got home, she had snapped me saying she'd see me soon, later this week. So again, I blocked her because she had creeped me out. A week goes by and I heard nothing from Katie. That was until I was cleaning up and went to take out the trash. As I opened my door, I was stunned to see Katie inside a car in front of my house. Freaked out, I dropped the trash bag and slammed my door. To this day, I don't know what she intended to do or what she wanted, but my advice to anyone reading this is always check to see if your SnapMap location is on or not.